Hi, I'm Vanessa Dixon. Welcome to All Points Bulletin on therapycable.com, where we talk about hot and sometimes controversial issues that are facing our communities. I'd like to introduce Dr. Al Valdez, who has not only been a coworker of mine, a colleague, a mentor, but also has become a really good friend. And Dr. Valdez and I have worked on several projects together, but one of the things that we're going to talk about today in this show, I really want to pay attention to what happens to young people in trauma. How does trauma affect their brain development? And I know that you've been on, quite a few shows, and also, your work that you've done at UCI. So Dr. Valdez is not only a professor of psychology at UCI, a former police officer from Anaheim, California, but also worked for, I know, now I'm aging you, right?
Yes, now you're aging me. Thank you so much.
But also worked for the Orange County DA's office as well for, I won't even get the amount of years, but retired from there as well.
Yeah, you can say about 20 years.
Yes, 15, right?
Yeah.
Well, welcome, Dr. Valdez. But just a little bit about what some of the research that you've been doing on trauma and how it affects brain development.
First, thank you for having me. And I think our viewers should understand, depending on what age the trauma happens, you might get different effects. For example, if small children experience trauma during the first 5 stages of brain development, you might see a different effect when they're adolescent or teenager years versus our military men and women who are in combat, and they come back traumatized. I think what we want to do is set a baseline. We want everybody to understand that brain development really doesn't stop till you're about 24, 25 years old. And it's that 5th stage that starts right around puberty where you see the most profound effects as young adults experience trauma. If you look what's happening at the Middle East, if you look at the average age of our military combatants overseas, 19 years age, they're not done yet. You're not even done through puberty until that final stage of brain development. And we can see readily the effects of what happens to experiencing combat for those folks when they come back. I have 5 sons and 4 are combat veterans, and all 4 have come back changed. Versus the young kids in the Middle East, say in the Gaza Strip, who are 8 and 9 years old experiencing the war there. It takes a toll on their development. And basically, some of the research suggests that people can become sort of inoculated to violence, for lack of a better word, that the effect of violence seems to be less with them if you experience it all the time. So when we look at violence, you got to look at what age and the type of violence that's perpetrated on your patient, so to speak. If it's sexual assault, is it physical assault, is it psychological, emotional issues, versus the trauma of war that you experience as a young adult.
Right. So if we had to kind of break it down and relate it to maybe some of the young people that we're starting to see, and I know you and I have talked before, in poverty being an issue of trauma as well, and the effects that it has. And I think that, and I'm not saying that every person who has grown up in poverty has some type of trauma or is guaranteed to have trauma, but I think we're starting to see, or we know that there's a strong correlation between poverty, young people, and the outcome on the rest of their lives and the decisions that they're making.
Let's be honest with each other. If we look at one of the current humanitarian crises that's affected the United States, we have approximately 57,000 unaccompanied youth, minors under the age of 18 who have migrated from Honduras and El Salvador, trucked across Mexico and come in to our southern border, plus about 40,000 single moms with kids. And I know there's a big controversy in the U.S. I know Americans have big hearts and we want to reach out and try and help these kids. But let's look at the cause and not the symptom of why they're here. If you look at the cause of what motivated these people to move, it's poverty and violence. And extreme poverty will drive people to move. It has an effect on brain development. If you look just in America, people who are poor tend to live in very low socioeconomic areas. There's a lot of transient movement. You tend to live in the cheapest hotels, apartments. Those areas seem to be most affected by violence and crime, prostitution, child perpetrators. You look at all those issues combined, and poverty really gives people a myopic view of life. They get tunnel vision. And I think somebody who said it most correctly was Stanley Tukey Williams, who was accredited for trying to be one of the co-founders of the Crips, before he was executed, he said, when I grew up, I had two choices. In my neighborhood, in my life, I had two choices. I could be the victim or I could be the perpetrator. And he says, I chose to be the perpetrator. That's what happens with poverty. You get that tunnel vision and the choices you have are actually limited. And so kids tend to make bad choices, and the effects of poverty have profound effects on brain development later on in life, especially if they're 8, 9, 12 years old, 13, 14, 15, 16, because they'll make a mistake that gets them involved in the criminal justice system, and once they're there, they're pretty much lost.
Can you just kind of describe some of the mistakes that you do see young people making because of trauma or because of, and again, I realize that there's different categories that somebody may react to trauma very differently from a sexual assault versus somebody who, has grown up in a very violent home or has seen, whatever it is in their neighborhoods or environment.
You bring up a great question, because a lot of people don't understand. With our 5 sons, my wife always said that when they turned 14, 15, 16, they were aliens because she didn't understand them. I think most parents, when their kids become high school freshmen, think that. There's a reason for that. One of the side effects of the hormones that causes those physical changes for puberty also does a couple of things to the brain during development. It releases impulse control, which is a frontal lobe process, right? And kids make stupid bonehead decisions, right? And the second thing that happens is kids try to develop their social identity from the group they hang around with. And that's why a lot of parents spend extra time and money trying to motivate their kids to belong to sports teams, clubs in high schools, church things, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, whatever it is, because usually the kids there have good adult mentors that guide them, and they get their social worth from that group they belong to. But in dysfunctional families, or families that have extreme forms of poverty, where parents can't afford the $3,000 you need to have your kid play football nowadays, or the $1,500 to send your kid to wrestling, or the $5,000 that some parents pay to have their daughters in cheer because they have to put them to dance in all the uniforms. If they're not don't have that financial wherewithal, where do those kids go?
Right.
And again, as Stanley said, they get tunnel vision and they view that their choices are gangs or these other dysfunctional groups. And they make these, what turns out to be for some of them, fatal mistakes. Because while they're with this group, they've developed this group mentality, this group identity, and we see that with our gang members, we see that with kids who belong to dysfunctional groups, and then next thing you know, they start using drugs, and we already know that marijuana is the most common drug, illegal drug in America used by our teenagers today. And so there's a myriad effect, there's a plethora of effects, tons of things and choices our kids have. And nobody's even talked about the internet.
Can we kind of divide it between, and again, I think that females are probably the least that we talk about. I think that even again, from my experience in law enforcement and teaching, at the college level, it's interesting how much we don't focus on young women and the issues that they have. We either don't have placement for them or we don't have opportunity. So can you kind of just divide a little bit between choices between the boys and the girls?
Sure. First of all, the research clearly tells us that women think differently than men, that women process differently than men. Us guys, when you're looking at us, if we're focused on something, we tend to use the left hemisphere of our brain. We're left hemisphere dominant. Women use both sides of the brain. That little bridge between both hemispheres called the corpus callosum. It looks structurally just a little bit different in women, or some people will say not different at all, but women use both sides of the brain, which means they process information differently. Therefore, women might look at violence differently. The research clearly tells us that ladies, it's a gender thing now, that can use drugs less than men, with less concentrations than males do, and they can get addicted. So there's something from the gender role that causes women to look at these things, and women also do something men don't do. Women have babies. And we now know and understand clearly that a form of acceptance by some women, especially from dysfunctional families and dysfunctional lifestyles and poverty, that a form of affection is having relations with somebody, because that's a form of self-worth.
Right.
And so women get pregnant, the guy leaves, the teenager guy leaves, and you have a teenage mom who's now in the system, in our social welfare system. Women present a whole different issue because women in custody present different needs than men in custody do. Women growing up and going through that puberty process react differently than men do to the same stimuli. So there's a whole ton of things we could talk about with ladies.
Right, and that was one of the interesting things the first time I ever taught women in the criminal justice system, just the research and the effect of how when women are incarcerated, women with children that are incarcerated, it has a larger effect on the children and their loss. And I'm not saying that dads don't play a major role, but it was interesting to see that it was almost so much more damaging because not only have you now lost the nurturer, but kids are also adopted, especially in California, a lot faster when mom is in the system and there's nobody else to take custody. So I mean, there's a lot of
you just hit a great issue to talk about, because just in the last 12 months, some research has been released from UC Irvine that suggests that whether it's a mom or dad in custody, there's collateral effect to the family, especially when small children are involved.
Right. So again, I mean, we're going to take a short break, but I want to kind of come back on that as well.
Absolutely.
And just kind of revisit, again, the differences between men and women and incarceration. And, again, I know that trauma affects, men and women completely differently as well. So we're just going to take a quick break, little message from our sponsors, and we'll be back.
Hi, welcome to Adolescence. This is Adolescence Recovery, and my name is Yvette Kuglin, and I'm part of the staff.
Adolescence Recovery Center has helped people in dual diagnosis for 5 years. We accept most PPO insurances and provide luxury accommodations and 24-hour support. To speak with an admissions counselor, call 1-888-242-4450.
A lot of time we don't even know what's wrong with us, and sometimes we need to get away to figure that out. So if you want to go for a little retreat out in Corona Del Mar, which is a confidential location, we're here to help. So we're only a phone call away. Thank you.
Hi, and welcome back to All Points Bulletin on therapycable.com. Dr. Valdez, I just want to kind of recap before we took the break a little bit about what we talked about. We visited areas of violence, the effects of violence that create trauma, poverty. I want to get into, I know we talked a little bit about dysfunctional families, and I eventually want to talk a bit about drugs and also what you refer to as ACE, the adolescent child experience growing up. But just a little bit where we left off on women, why women... I know that you talk about women thinking differently, but the effect it really does have.
Well, actually, what we want to note is that women actually process things differently than men do, and that affects the way they look at life. That affects the way they look at poverty and how these experiences affect them as well. There's a big difference how women react who have been in combat, or small females who have been sexually assaulted, or females that have witnessed violence at home, especially in a DV home. Right? So women actually process the same stimuli differently than men do, which causes them to have a whole different outview and perspective on life. Mm-hmm. Right? Sometimes childhood experiences, and you mentioned ACE, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Sometimes our adolescent childhood experiences affect what happens to you as a young adult. They help form how you see the world from your perspective. And if you've had a really harsh childhood experiences, I'm not saying everybody does, but if you have a really harsh childhood experiences full of that brain trauma during brain development, there's a chance that you might have some issues, mental health issues as a young adult or a teenager, all based on what happened to you.
What types of mental health issues? Because I think that I'm not saying it's a new phenomenon, but I mean, this is a hot button topic that we're really not addressing on, because there's so many, whether it's HIPAA or FERPA, that we're not talking about kids with mental health. So
it's the white elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about. But if you talk to our elementary school teachers, there's those few students in kindergarten or first grade that are really disruptive. Unfortunately, we've had incidences where kindergartner students stab pregnant teachers in the belly with pencils, or they expose themselves. These are not normal childhood behaviors. Sometimes these kids have more knowledge about sex than they should for their age. You have to start looking at these things, but because of our environment, it is the white elephant, and we tend, little Johnny or little Mary, they're having a bad day, right? They're always a bad day. We tend to build excuses to justify these behaviors, and we treat a symptom rather than cause. And I think
Right.
I think you've hit a big nail on the head, and that's where ACE comes in.
So ACE again is the adolescent child, basically adolescent child experiences.
Right. It is an assessment tool provided by the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, and it's solely an assessment tool that kind of measures all those forms of brain trauma and life experiences that could have a profound effect on normal development and normal
Right.
development of relationships and normal social interactions. And it's a great predictor, when used properly, that might help mental health therapists or mental health professionals ease the pain of their patients. But a lot of people don't look at that oftentimes. It's a childhood experience. Life goes by so fast. I mean, if you look at the latest statistics, it's suggested that parents talk at their children probably 5 to 8 minutes a day. And I have to ask you, and be really honest, how do you know what's going on in your child's life if you're telling them, do the homework, feed the dog, make sure the dog gets out, put this food in the microwave, I'll be home at 6, providing the traffic's not heavy, right? And that's always a day when the traffic is really heavy and the parent doesn't get home till 7. I mean, how do you know what's going on with your kid's life? To counteract some of these negative things we talked about, there are things that parents can do. Once a week, share a meal with your family. Once a week,
Right.
sit down, turn off the cell phones, nobody texts, nobody takes any calls, there's no TV, there's no radio, and you actually sit and talk with your children. Well, a novel idea. You and I shared lunch today, and we talked a little bit about this, but we talked about our lives,
Right.
And we had a great conversation between us in about 30 minutes. And I rarely get to see you because you're so busy and I'm so busy. But we keep in that connectivity, which is very, very important. Children need to have that connectivity, that foundation with their family. They need to know they can go back to mom or dad, that they can talk to mom or dad about anything. And those lines of communication start at a very young age, from the moment your child's born. And that's why you need to caress your child and hug them and kiss them and tell them you love them, tell them they're going to be okay. And you got to be there for them, because it is these lifelong experiences
Right.
that builds those bonds, those sort of life nets, as we would call it, that protects those kids, so that when they go through these adolescent years during puberty and they get influenced by all these things, they don't fall through the cracks. And it doesn't matter whether you're a single parent or a dual parent family, you need those life nets, and that's what saves kids. And that's why we see in the mental health profession and criminal justice profession why so many young kids have all these issues, because they've fallen through those cracks. You go back, there's trauma. And every time there's trauma, that creates a big hole in that life net. And there's a greater chance for them to fall through. So I think we need to look at those issues, and I think ACE is a great tool, a great assessment tool. It's one of many, but I happen to like it. I think it's a good tool.
Okay, yeah, and that's a great suggestion. And I do think when we start to see, obviously we've had issues with school violence and community violence, and again, it's that same age factor. It's the young kids, unfortunately, young boys between, the ages of like 18 and 24, and we're really not picking up. And as much as I teach about kids that witness violence, I sometimes will say jokingly, like, there's no reporting forum for a weird kid.
No.
We've all gone to school with a weird person, we've all worked with a weird person, but unfortunately, that sometimes we don't have a venue where, we can really raise red flags unless there's something pretty severe there.
Yeah, I was working out this morning. I get up early to work out, and I go every morning 6 days a week, so I know most of the morning people. This morning, there was a young man, 30, 35. He came in and he's wearing the 3/4 length black shorts. He was wearing army boots with black socks. He had a black sweatshirt and the hood over his head, and he wasn't looking at anybody. And every machine he went to, he got a wipe out and meticulously wiped the germs off of it. I mean, he stuck out like a red flag, because
Right.
it's the first time I've seen him there in 3 months. But there's nothing what did he do wrong? Did he do anything illegally wrong? And that's one of the issues. And when you talk about these people who stand out and do weird things, he didn't do anything illegally. So there's no way to report him to the police, except all your sensors go up and go, this guy, something's wrong with him. And I watched him just for a moment, because he wasn't staring at a lady, he was leering at a lady.
Right.
And it was not a healthy, oh, she's a good looking lady. It wasn't one of those healthy things. It kind of creeped me out. But again, what did he do illegally? So how do we treat these kids in high school and elementary school and junior high who act like that? and it's not illegal.
Right.
I mean, right now in this county, in Orange County, kids who are disruptive in class don't get disciplined as they did a year ago. It's different now. And here, these are the red flags. What do we do with those loner kids that come to school with the black trench coats and the black hats? How do we identify the kids, the victims of bullies?
Right.
Right? To prevent them from snapping. There are no in-house mechanisms. And nobody wants to go talk to the school psychologist or the school principal. Nobody wants to report it because of that societal stereotype we have. When one of my sons got out of the Army, I'll never forget this. He was a warrior. There's some people in some very unique specialty forces in the Army, and there was about 200 soldiers there. And a brand new boot lieutenant said, "Hey, any of you who have mental health issues, raise your hand. We'll take you to see the shrink." In that kind of condescending tone. And nobody's going to raise their hand. Yet every single one of those 200 young men and women needed help. Right? And that's the way our society is. There's a stigma. If you raise your hand, if you see a psychologist, a mental health professional, you're kind of viewed as weak or weird. Society, oh, you're seeing somebody. Right? And yet, it is those mental health professionals that act like anchors and help people work their problems out over and over and over, but nobody celebrates that. Nobody talks about that. Everybody wants to be you strong. Everybody wants to be the football player, the baseball player, the great success story. And unfortunately, in today's world, the green stuff, money, is what motivates our kids because they think money is success. Money will buy you love. Money will buy you happiness. And because they're not fully developed in their brain, they don't realize that money doesn't do anything. Except make life a little easier. You don't have to choose between putting a gallon of gas in your car and not eating that day, right? Or putting 2 gallons of gas in your car and going without a lunch because you're at school. I mean, many people make those decisions, and we don't celebrate that. We don't encourage that. And so, yes, there are some major issues with our kids today.
Right, and it's true. I mean, you think that we've evolved in so many ways, but asking for help is just still continues to be such a stigma in so many areas. I just want to add a little bit too, or ask you, and again, all the different areas that we've talked about, one of the areas that we haven't talked about is drug abuse.
Terrible.
And again, drug abuse, whether it's illegal drugs, obviously we know meth is a huge problem. I mean, the kids that we kind of talked to last year in the gang intervention program, they were all recovering.
It's very sad to say, and you know this stat. America has less than 5% of the world's population, and as a nation, we consume over half the world's illegal drugs. The market's here. We know that for our teenage population, that marijuana and alcohol are the most frequently abused drugs. We also know that a number of our kids, even though the numbers reportedly decrease, they're still smoking cigarettes. You mentioned methamphetamine. On the western half of the United States, methamphetamine is the leading central nervous system stimulant being abused by people, and it is the most addictive. In 1980, working undercover as an undercover narcotics investigator, I fell into a meth lab in Anaheim, the west end of Anaheim, and the guy was making like 4 pounds in 36 hours, and they thought, oh my God, that was a huge amount back then. DEA came, huge. The Mexican cartels make 400 pounds every 24 hours, 7 days a week, and they cannot keep up with the meth appetite in America today. That's the fastest growing, in my opinion, one of the fastest growing drugs of abuse in the central nervous system stimulant category.
And again, add that to trauma and all the other categories that we've talked about, and we're just adding another layer of dysfunction and what have you.
Which brings us back to those kids that came across the border. They're seeking help here in America. Nobody looks at the effects of the drug being transferred through their countries, because in Central American countries and Mexico right now, there's a growing addict population for cocaine and methamphetamine, and nobody knows the long-term effect that will have on those children in those countries. We know that right now the violence and poverty is motivating a lot of them to leave their country, and they're seeking safety and haven here in America, and it is a humanitarian issue. How do we help these kids? And herein lies a dilemma. If we allow these 97,000 immigrants to come in our country and we give them amnesty or allow them to stay, what do we do with the kids that are in the same condition, same boat in China or Russia, right? Or North Korea or other parts of Europe, the Ukraine? We can't help all the children. which means that we're kind of in a dilemma. How do we help these? I think America's kind of torn in half here. Some Americans want to help these kids, and some other ones want to follow the law, to the letter of the law. They're here illegally, so we have to deport them.
And in the meantime, I mean, we have so many kids in our own communities that are so affected by, methamphetamine abuse. And
What do we do with the homeless children here? The
Right.
homeless vets, or the homeless families? Do we not help them so we can help the illegal immigrants who have come through, or the undocumented immigrants? I mean, it is a hard choice because Americans would like to help, but we can't. We have limited resources. And so, I don't know. There's a lot of folks that think we should help the folks at home. But trauma, what's happening to those young kids, trauma-wise, from their journey over, and now the trauma being deported back, like being put out of the frying pan into the fire.
So if you were able to just, and I know this sounds a little silly, but to take a magic wand or be able to, have enough money to fund some kind of youth program, how would you see it? What would it look like to you?
I've often thought about that, and I think I'd reach out to the youth in our county, or develop a program that can be used as a template that can be applied to any county. It could be used in Georgia, it can be used in New York, Tennessee. We'll develop a skeleton that can be customized. People can put their own nuances on it to help their particular community, but aiming at after-school programs for kids,
Right.
because most of the juvenile violence happens between 2 and 8, right? So after-school programs that have good adult leaders. Get the community involved, get business involved to be business mentors, have a tattoo removal program, have aid for parents who need job counseling, parent counseling. Help people that way, because as well as I do, and so do our listeners, that the unit that this all begins with is the family.
Right.
So strong families mean strong kids.
And that's one of the things that I really liked about therapycable.com was that, the different videos that are on here, also part of the goal is to take down the stigma of asking for help, to deal with mental illness, to be able to, get online. And if you can't afford, healthcare or something, that just start listening, start, figuring out how we can start fixing things. And I think that one of the biggest deficits we have right now is our community is not connected,
I think Bobby Kennedy said it in his speech most correctly, is that we all live in a community, but we're not part of it. We all have different agendas. And I think that's the way America is today. And I think that if the community becomes united, that will be most beneficial for the community in general, but also the individual families.
Yeah, I often ask my students how many of them know their neighbors, and they say, who?
No, yeah.
So, I just wanted to kind of wrap up with just a little bit about what we talked about. And again, I think that adolescent child experiences, I really enjoy the fact that you talked about that assessment, and, hope that our viewers will look into that, and they can access that from the website of
The Center for Disease Control in Atlanta.
Okay.
It's there, it's downloadable in a PDF form, and if you write them, they'll send you the key on how to analyze the data you collect.
Okay. And again, Dr. Valdez, I can't tell you, I mean, as much as I bragged about you in the beginning, you have been just being only out here in California for the last 4 years, you've been a support system, you've been a mentor, you've been a friend, and I can't thank you enough for all that you've done for me professionally, personally, and for my career as well. So
I'll have to pay her. I'll
Yeah.
have to pay her for that later.
But thank you. Thank you for watching All Points Bulletin, and I look forward to having another show with you at some
Yes,
point. Dr.
absolutely.
Valdez. Thank you.